right, so my name is Pastor Doug. I'm one of the Doug Porter. I'm one of the lay elders, which means I'm a pastor that is not on staff here. And so every now and then, I'm sorry if this is your first time here with us. I do want to apologize that you don't get to see Pastor Derek. So you'll be greatly disappointed next week when you realize how much better looking I am than him. So when they get to be lazy, they ask me to come and preach, and so I get a chance a couple times a year to come up and preach, which I'm always excited to do. But the passage we're in this morning is one that God has personally used in my life over the past several years, and I'm going to share more about that later in the service. But recently, God has brought it back up and has just reminded me of it. And so as I was thinking and praying through what it was that I felt led to preach, because anytime I have an opportunity to preach at a time that is not part of a series we're currently in, I always try to think very open-handedly with, like, God, what do you have for me? What do you have for our church to hear at this time? Like, what is there something specifically that you want us to kind of to dive into? And this is something that I felt was fitting to the season that we're in as a young multi-ethnic church that's striving to do good. The idea of what does it look like to do good, to be consistent in doing good. All right. And so we are going to be walking through that. Now, this morning, two things. One, we do have our little proclaimers here. All right. So the little ones, it's Family Sunday, so we got our little ones with us. So if you're a kid, Marty, don't raise your hand. If you're a kid and you're used to little proclaimers, raise your hand, holler, stand up. Let me know you're here. I know we got a couple here. I see there's another in the back. Who else we got? Oh, there's Blakely and Cora. Michael coming in. Mills. All right. But anyway, so we got some of our little proclaimers. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I missed y'all too. Anyway, we got several of our little proclaimers here this morning. So what I want y'all to know is that we made sure you've got some sermon notes on the way in. And so if you didn't get that, I saw you, Stella. I'm sorry. We did have sermon notes out there. So if you did not get sermon notes, little ones, guys, go out and get them, because there's some notes that we're going to be going through. So what I did is I wrote down some different notes for y'all to fill in the blanks and places that y'all I'm gonna point out for you to, like, draw pictures or to list some things and answer some questions that go along with what we're doing this morning. Okay, so there is some stuff that I'll tell y'all to do, and I'll make sure y'all good on that. Everybody got one? Little proclaimers, give me a thumbs up if you're good. You're good? Okay. So I am a teacher by trade. I've actually got a couple of my coworkers here this morning with me, but that means that when I'm thinking about teaching, I always want to think about, like, what do I want the person listening to walk away with? What I want them to know, what I want them to learn. And so I've asked myself, what is the big picture question of this service, of this sermon? And so the one I've thought about as I was just processing this passage is, why should we do good? Like, what does it look like, and why should we do it to do good? Why should we be doing good? And the things that I want us to follow through, there'll be four things that I'm going to hit on about doing good. We're going to come back to these later and unpack them, but I want to go ahead and give you a map of where we're going now. Is one, that good things are God things. Two, that good things serve God. Three, that good things serve others. And four, good things can be hard things. Little ones, I'm coming back to it, so if you didn't get it now, it's okay. I'll make sure y'all have a chance to fill those in later as well, okay? So, before we break down this text, though, I want us to understand the context of where we're at, the background of the book of Galatians. Now, as we're going through this, I did have, there's a picture that'll be up here that's like a picture that some of y'all have, guys, on the back that has like 3 blocks that says Galatians across the top. All right. What this is I'm going to give our little ones a chance to kind of take notes on the background, because understanding the background of a book of the Bible when you're younger can be, a little more confusing. So I want to make sure that they know what we're talking about and can follow along. So what I'm using is the thing called the Bible Project. If you've never heard of it, it's amazing. It's a resource that's online. It's got a thumbs up from Will in the back. It is a resource that's online that just breaks down books of the Bible and different theological concepts really, really well, and very accessibly. Like, it makes it easy to understand complex things. And so I'm using that this morning up front because I want the kiddos to be able to follow along with us, and I want to make sure that we all understand it. And the soapbox with that, too, is that I'm not teaching down to kids, right? You don't teach down to kids. if you can't explain something to a child, you probably don't know it in the first place. So, like, you don't teach down to kids, you teach to kids, and it should apply to everyone, right? That they're not watering down. There's not a Holy Spirit Junior. There's not a second version of the Bible. If they're following Christ or learning to follow Christ, the Word is the Word. And so that's what today we're going to walk through just what the Word says. So background of the book of Galatians. It was written to churches in the city of Galatia. And in some ways, like I said, it reminds me of us a little because it's a multi-ethnic city. It's a multi-ethnic church where they've dealt with non-Jewish Christians, ultimately some of the first time, which means people who were what they called Gentiles, which means they weren't Jewish, right? Which is most of us, if not all of us in here. And they're also a relatively young church. Now, the exact date I couldn't tell you, but I know that like this letter was written within 50 years, most people believe, of Jesus' death. And I believe it's also believed that Paul would have been there not far before that. So this is not, it may be a little older than we are as a church, but not much, right? And so they've got a young multi-ethnic church that is been taught and established by Paul, that's following the gospel. But then what happens here, though, and this is Paul is addressing a very particular issue that has come up in this church. See, Christianity, as I said, I mentioned like non-Jewish, Christianity started out as a Jewish movement, but was meant for all people everywhere, right? And so it quickly began to spread to other parts of the world, to the Gentiles, which again means non-Jewish people. And so what happened is this ended up leading to a debate. See, Jewish people would have been following the Torah, or what we call the law, the Old Testament. And what's starting to happen is they're debating is should non-Jewish Christians, were they called to follow the laws of the Torah, or are they not? All right, and so some believed that they did, that in order to truly be a Christian, they needed to follow the Torah, the law as well. And some of those people teaching that had come to Galatia. And what happens is they're telling the Gentile Christians there that in order for them to follow Jesus, they have to follow Jesus plus all this other stuff. So Paul's angered by this and is writing this letter to address this issue. So he addresses this issue in three main sections. And kids, you have this on your paper. So the first section, you got three boxes there. The first section is chapters 1 and 2, right? It's where in the first two chapters, he reminds them of the gospel of the crucified Jesus. So you can write this in the box, and it's going to be up here. Doing good does not save us. Okay, write this in the box. Doing good does not save us. What does save us? Who knows? I know we talk about it. Some of the little guys. Blakely or Cora, I know y'all know. Michael, what saves us? If doing good doesn't save us, what does? They say God. Yeah, so Jesus saves us, right? We're saved through the work of Jesus, right? So what I want y'all to draw while y'all are listening, if you want to draw something, you can draw a picture of the cross, or you can draw a picture of the empty tomb, because it reminds us that we are saved by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, right? But Paul is reminding us that the gospel, above the true gospel. See, he's saying that what they've done here is that they've begun to betray the gospel of Jesus because they're separating themselves over good works of the flesh. So rather than resting in what Jesus has done, they're saying you have to have Jesus plus these other things. And he actually calls this a false gospel and a betrayal of the gospel. And the fact of the matter is, and he points this out in chapter 2, is that we've been made right with God because of Jesus, not because of anything we've done. We are justified by what God did through Jesus, not what we can or what we do for ourselves. So when people trust in Christ, what's true of him becomes true of them, right? That Jesus was perfect for us so that through Jesus we can be made perfect. And what's happening is they're starting to divide over this. So Paul starts off by reminding them, no, you're not saved by good works. You're not saved by following the law. You're saved because of the good news of the crucified Jesus. All right, so that's sections 1 and 2. Or chapters 1 and 2. The second section, he kind of transitions from talking about the gospel of crucified Jesus to talking about how the gospel of Jesus then creates a new multi-ethnic family, about how it draws all people to himself, okay? Now, so kids, y'all can write this, is that Jesus was good for us, right? So that here you can write Jesus was good for us. And while we're doing this, we're going to talk about the law, or we're going to talk about the law here in just a second, which is like a list of things that God gave us that we are supposed to follow. And so what I want y'all to think about, because I'm going to point out to you in just a second what the law was meant for, why it existed, is I want y'all to think about what are some of the ways that you've broken God's law and messed up. All right, think about things like you lied, or maybe you've gotten mad and hit your sibling, or maybe you cheated, or maybe you've gotten in trouble for disobeying, but it's something you've done. All of us have done something. See, because what Paul is showing us here, he, rather than saying that you have to follow the law, he predates the good news of the gospel and says that actually, he points out that no, actually this was always the purpose and plan, and that when Abraham believed through faith that God would give him a huge family, that promise was fulfilled through Jesus, and that if we're followers of Jesus, we date ourselves not back to following the law, but back to what God promised to Abraham even before that, right? So what did I know we've talked about this in Little Proclaimers. What did God promise Abraham? Y'all remember? That he would have a huge what? Y'all remember? Yeah, thank you, Michael. A huge family, right? That his children would outnumber the stars, that it would be more than the grains of sand. And so what Paul is pointing out is that this large multi-ethnic family has been what God had planned from the beginning, and that Jesus fulfills that promise. So then the question becomes, what do we do with the law? If the good news of the gospel predated the law, so what is the law for? And so the law did two things, Paul points out. It does a negative and a positive. The negative is it's like a magnifying glass. Now, this is not a negative in like that the law's bad, but this is the negative side of the law. Is it like a magnifying glass? Is it shows you what sin is already there, right? It shows you that we've all sinned. So when you hold something up to, how many of you have ever used a magnifying glass? All right? Yeah, if you're using a magnifying glass, you're using it to help you find something small. Sometimes you use a microscope to see things you couldn't see with your own eyes, right? Or if you wear glasses, like these are magnifying glasses because my eyes are bad, right? It helps me to see things that I could not see otherwise. So what the law is doing is it points out our sin. It shows us the ways we've messed up. The second thing it does is the positive, is that it's like a strict school teacher, Paul says, that has kept them in line until Jesus came to free them from it. So it's showing them their sin, and then it's holding them in check until Jesus comes to free them from it, okay? So having to follow the laws for salvation, Paul says, is like acting like Jesus never did any of this for us. So Paul is very clearly pointing out that the law cannot save, and that Jesus came to create a new multi-ethnic family through him, and that's been the plan from the beginning, okay? So that's the first two sections. Let's look at the last section. This is going to narrow us into our closer to where we're going to land. This is chapters 5 and 6, and this is where he talks about the fact that the family that God creates through Jesus is a family that is transformed by the Spirit, okay? A family that is transformed by the Spirit. So kids, y'all can write on your page that we do good things through the Spirit. We do good things through the Spirit. Now, we're going to talk about what's called the fruit of the Spirit, and we're going to talk about good works that we do. So while you're sitting there, if you want to draw a picture of a fruit, you want a picture of a fruit tree, you can make a list of maybe some of the things that you can think of that we could do that shows the good news of Jesus to others. You can make notes in that way while we're breaking down this passage, okay? But what Paul does here is he points out that while we're not saved through our works, that we are saved to works, essentially. We learn God's will through the Spirit, and that the law is good to love your neighbor, but we can't obey that law on our own. That Jesus came to free us. He did it for us. And then as he lives in us through the Spirit, we can then fulfill the law by loving God and loving others. Remember, Jesus even said this previously, right? In some of his teachings, he pointed out that they asked him, what's the greatest teaching? And he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he said to love your neighbor as yourself. So this is something that's tying back to Jesus' teachings. All right, this is something that's pointing out that Jesus did this for us. And then he starts to talk about, Paul starts comparing our old humanity with fruit of the Spirit. So the fruits of our flesh versus the fruits of what God produces in us as we follow after him. All right. And so the old humanity, he talks about things, and I think some of you, some of the older guys, you'll have a sheet on the back that has some of this list. But talks about where our flesh produces things like envy and greed and anger and hate. But then the fruits of the Spirit. Who's heard of the fruits of the Spirit before? Anybody know what they are? What are the fruits of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. And then he says, against such things there are no... But yeah, the fruit. So he's comparing these two things, right? He's saying there's two types of things that are produced. There's either the fruit of our flesh, our old humanity, that's produced through us working out, like trying work, that's produced through ourselves and through our sin, or there's the fruit of the Spirit that's produced by following God. All right. And what he starts doing is he starts pointing out the differences here, but then he points out that they both require cultivation. Now, what does it mean to cultivate something? Cultivate means to like work it and to take care of it and to till it and to plant and sow and reap. It's to work towards something, right? And so this leads us to the passage where we are today, because this starts tying in that idea that he talks about in verse 8 of what we read earlier about the idea of sowing and reaping. Now, this was written, sowing and reaping, this was written to a pretty highly agricultural community who would understand what that meant. But sowing and reaping are simply this. Sowing is like planting, and reaping is picking or harvesting after it's grown. All right. So if you plant apple seeds, what fruit are you going to get? Apples, right? If you plant apple seeds, you're going to reap apples. All right. So the planting, the watering, the growing, the taking care of your fruit, that is hard work. And I'm going to come back to that idea of cultivating the hard work of that. It takes time, but that's what it means to cultivate. What you take care of is what's going to grow. All right. How many of you have ever planted tomatoes and grew corn? You have? Okay. Nice. That's impressive. Let's talk later. But yeah, you don't plant. You're not gonna pick. You're not gonna grow what you didn't plant. And so that's what he's talking about here. Paul's getting at this idea of if your actions plant seeds of the flesh, then what's going to grow is sin. And if your actions plant seeds of the Spirit, then what's going to grow is the Spirit, right? He's saying that just like the physical world has a cause effect of what you do produces fruit, the spiritual world has a similar effect of the actions we feed are the actions that grow. All right? And so that's important for us to think about when we're thinking about our actions. Like, what are we doing? Now, again, to be very, very clear, these good works that he's telling us to do and that we're talking about are not the ones that save us, right? These are not works for salvation. They're works that are coming from our salvation, right? That we're saved, and then the Spirit produces these things in us. So this is not salvation. This is talking about what it looks like to follow God. Because we're saved through the gospel, right? And I heard, I read this from Tim Keller, our pastor used to say something similar to this, is that the gospel is not the ABCs of Christianity. The gospel is the A to Z of Christianity. It's not what gets you into heaven. It's what, and then there's something deeper later, right? It's like we keep coming back to the gospel because the gospel is not just what saves us, it's what sustains us, it's what grows us, it's what makes us more like Jesus, right? As we go, as we grow. All right. We used to say at our church that it's not the it's not the diving board into Christianity, it's the pool. It's everything that is what it means to follow Jesus is the gospel, not just the beginning of it. And so here we're seeing that to follow Christ means that we're continually putting our lives under a microscope because we're saved already. We've already been saved through what Jesus has done, but we're continuing to strive to do good works so that we can produce good fruit. All right. So this leads us to our passage where he talks about this idea of doing good. So why should we be doing good then? So there's the four things. The first one, why should we do good is because one, good things are God things. Good things are God things. God is good. So that means that anything that comes from him is good as well, right? This includes the actions or the sowing of good things through the Spirit. But this also includes the way we love and serve others. When we spend time with God, when we spend time growing, when we spend time telling others about Jesus, if it is good, it came from God, which is why we're called to do good things. Why should we do good things? Because good things are God things. When we do good, we're doing the work of God and we're continuing what God has called his people to do since the beginning. When God created Adam and Eve, he said they were image bearers, and then he gave them the call to go and continue to create and make good things, right? We still have that call on us. And so when we do good things in the world, we're doing those things that are God things. Does that include telling people about Jesus and preaching the gospel? Absolutely. But that also includes taking the skills that God has given you and using them to the best of your ability to see the goodness of God come in the city. It looks like loving and being kind to your classmates, to your coworkers, to your neighbors. When we say that good things are God things, that means everything that is good came from God. So when we do something good, it is for God. It doesn't save us, but it is a God thing. All right, secondly, we also see that good things serve God. When we do good things through the Spirit, we are serving and honoring God. When it's this isn't saving us, but because we're saved. How many of you have ever had a like a coach or some adult in your life that kind of held rules over you as a way to earn their love? Anybody? I have in different ways, right? Where what happens is when you're doing well, they may tell you everything's okay, and they may act or tell you they love you, or maybe they just don't do anything, but there's just no, you have to earn their love by following the rules, right? And when you don't, there's like this, it just, the hammer drops, right? The flip side is, how many of you have ever had an adult or a coach or a teacher or someone in your life that was the opposite of that? That they loved you regardless, and you knew that, but then they still gave you rules to follow. They still gave you things you were supposed to do. But whenever you messed up, the hammer didn't drop. They just came to you and corrected you lovingly, but it never changed how they felt about you, right? So those are two different, who are you going to want to follow? You're going to want to follow the one that loves you regardless and then calls you to do those things, right? So that's what it looks like when we're following Jesus. We're not following God. We're not doing good works to make God love us. We're doing good works because God loves us and has called us to do those things. So when we do the things he's called us to do, when we use the skills he's given us, when we preach the gospel, when we love the helpless, the hurting, when we love one another, we're serving God, okay? So the good things we do to follow Jesus and the law serve God, and they show his love to the lost and dying world around us. So good things are God things. Second, good things are serve God. Third, good things serve others. Good things serve others. In verse 10, Paul specifically says to do good to who? To everyone, right? There's not a caveat there. Now, he does go on and say especially to the house of the faithful, but he says to love everyone. See, this is continuing where Jesus taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves, like we were talking about earlier. It means we serve the least of these, the unlovable, the hurting, the homeless, the widow, the poor, the foreigner, the insert whatever it is. I read out of, this is from a book by Tim Keller, and it's a quote I'm going to read, and that I think is really helpful in kind of understanding this idea of good things to serve others. It says, what is this doing good sowing? It is to do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. This is sweeping and comprehensive in its simplicity. First, it shows that the Christian life is what the Christian life is all about. Not primarily meetings, programs, or even conversions, but doing good to the person in front of you, giving him or her what is best for them. Second, the word doing shows that we are to give them whatever love discerns as their needs. Of course, we share the gospel and evangelize, but only as a means to the end of loving them. We don't love them as a means to the end of converting them, but the word doing means that we must not confine ourselves to evangelism and discipling. We are to love in deed as well as in word. We are to give them any aid that is necessary to meet any need within our power to meet, whether it is material, social, or spiritual. This little phrase shows that Christian ministry includes helping at a rehabilitation home just as much as explaining to someone how to give their life to Christ. When we're serving God and doing good things, we do good things because it serves others. That is good because God has called us to love others. True love. And I think this is something that can get, and I'm not going to follow this tangent, I promise, but I'm going to say it for a second. I think love has lost its meaning in our world at times. And I think that we think that when we say that you can love somebody without showing them Jesus, that we've disconnected love from Jesus, but you can't do that, right? And so to love someone is to show them Jesus in word and deed. I won't keep chasing that, but to love someone is to show them Jesus. So we're doing good when we serve others because we're showing them who Jesus is. And then last, and this is where we'll begin to really, really wrap up, and I want to land for a while, is 4. This is on your page as well, kids. Good things can be hard things. Let me say that one more time. Good things can be hard things. As a matter of fact, quite often they are. If you look back at even the idea of the cultivating is hard work, right? Keller put it this way. It says, day by day, sowing to please the Spirit requires us to not become weary in doing good. There is always a delay between sowing and reaping. Especially new farmers and gardeners will experience a lot of anxiety watching over the dormant seed for weeks and weeks and feeling it will never come up. But it always comes up in the end. Let me say that again. There is a delay between sowing. There is always a delay between sowing and reaping. And that delay is hard. Something God has shown me a lot over the past 3 or 4 years and has made very, very clear to me is that good and hard are not mutually exclusive. Good and hard are not mutually exclusive. This is where this passage really God has used previously and has brought back into my life recently, or at least reminded me of, as a way of showing me his faithfulness. Because the way the verse ends is not just not grow weary in doing good, but it ends with do not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So if I take this back, I'll take it several years. This is a personal story of following God and it being hard. All right. Now, I'm not pretending that I have the hardest story of anyone here, but God, it's definitely a season where God has called us to good things that were definitely hard. So take it back to the beginning of, I think, 2019. Kristen and I were pursuing being, actually, it was our whole family because you can't do it without everyone. We were pursuing being foster parents. And so we started that training. We were going through the process, and we knew it was going to be hard. And we started beginning to have those conversations with Kieran of what does it look like, to the way we would say it would be to love big with open hands. Because what that allowed us to do is to say we're going to love for as long as we get them, and whenever we don't, we're open-handed with it too, though. Like we're going to love everyone as big as we can, recognizing that we have them for as long as you have them, right? So loving big with open hands. And again, I knew that this was going to be hard, and the beginning of that hard, and this is what I thought in ignorance at the time that was all the hard it would be, is we had a possible placement that we met. That's a spit everywhere. We had a possible placement that we met the kids and they came over, and then it ended up not working out. And I remember having to have that conversation with Kieran. He was at a day camp that while we were doing like an overnight camp, and I was able to pull him aside and kind of just talk through what was going on and explain to him like, hey, this is one of those situations where we've loved big. The time we had with them may have only been a few hours, but we loved them well, and now we're going to love them with open hands, and God's going to continue to be faithful. And again, I guess I don't know, I just didn't think of the continual hard, just the one-off hard. And that same week, as we were kind of preparing for that and thinking through it, God brought this verse to my heart of just do not grow weary of doing what is good. Do not get tired of doing what's good, which immediately implied the idea of if it's telling us not to go tired and not to get weary, that implies that it's probably not easy, right? You're not going to get weary from just sitting on the couch, really, right? You get weary from the trudge of doing something for a long time in a hard, sustainable, almost unsustainable way, right? So, and not getting weary of doing good. And God just reminded me of that. And that same week, it turns out, without me even knowing it separately, that had been the memory verse that Kieran had been memorizing at camp. And it was just very like, oh man, God, you're preparing us for something. I thought that what he was preparing us for was just that. And then over the next year and a half, 2.5 years, ended up being like 2.5, almost 3 of probably the hardest years of my life, if I'm honest. And I recognize that life is not over, but it was a very hard season. It kind of kicked off with a foster placement that we did get that was very, very difficult, and ended up not going the way we planned it would, and it ended very kind of imploded, to be honest, and it imploded right around the same time that we were praying about whether or not to move here, and so just timeline wise, he was with us through the fall, and then things are shortly after Christmas, things just became unsustainable, and it just became a very, very hard season. And right as that fell apart, it fell apart the week before we were coming here on the weekend. So like our lives fell apart on a Thursday, and then on Friday we got in the car and drove to Nashville. No, got on a plane and flew to Nashville to visit. Like, are we going to move here? And so the whole weekend we're sort of processing, like, what are you doing, God? Like, should we move here? What's supposed to happen with this other situation? What's happening? That was the same weekend, just for timeline perspective, that Kobe Bryant died. So it was all that same, like, timeline wise. I'm not putting it on the same importance. I'm just pointing out where it happened. Although that was very sad. So anyway, that imploded. We came and visited here. We got back and we had to kind of put together what home life looked like again in the middle of figuring out, like, what are you doing, Lord? And through that process of being a foster parent as well, God had just revealed some sin in my own life of anger and some other things that I had not dealt with before and had not realized was there. And so it was a hard season that was followed quickly by the news that there had been the tornado here that destroyed so much of the town. And then very shortly after that, everything shut down from COVID. And around the same time, we were deciding, do we move? Do we pick up everything we have that's comfortable and move and leave and move to somewhere where we don't know anything about? And God was like, yeah, you should. And we realized very quickly that comfort became the only reason not to go, which is not a good reason not to go. But comfort, it makes it really hard to go. So comfort should never keep you from something if it's the only reason, but it will make going very hard. And so we moved here in the middle of a pandemic. Church had not launched yet. I didn't have a job yet. We were in lockdown. Like, it was just kind of crazy. We had just had our home life turned upside down, and we're still recovering from that. And then in the midst of all of that, I started working at a new school that had merged and started with 95% turnover virtually. And so that was awesome. To start a new school essentially online just adds to the isolation that was COVID anyway. And just through all these different things, I just felt myself growing deeper and deeper and deeper into depression, honestly. And just went through a really, really hard season where I felt like I was drowning, just to be honest, and that nobody could see me. And that continued for a while. And we still, I'll be honest, at times we question, like, God, are we supposed to be here? Like, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Because this is really hard. And like, I don't feel like this should be happening. But we continue to be faithful to what we thought God had called us, even when it didn't feel like it. And through that time period, things began to slowly get better, but there was still a lot of the hangover of it, like you go through a hard season and it just takes a while for you to realize you're not in that anymore. And I think it was even just recently, like in the past 6 months or less, where this idea of although I recognize I was not always faithful. God was faithful through me. Um, that idea of reaping if you don't give up is not complete. It won't be complete this side of eternity. But there's some things that have happened this year at work, and then things that happen just through just perspective changes that we realized just how faithful God had been through all of it, and began to be able to see that, God, you really did place us here. And we're also starting to really fall in love with it. You've given us a community that we didn't have before, that we thought we had lost in moving. Um, you've given so as a young man, I wanted to be a missionary. God never opened that door. And a lot of the places that I had a heart for ended up all being in my classroom this school year. So like I have like 14 or 15 different nations that are represented in our classes. And several of them are parts of the world that I at one point wanted to go to. Um, uh, just recognizing that God had been faithful. Now, does it immediately get rid of all the hard? No. But it was that a small picture of what I hope continues to be true in my life, which I believe it will be because God is faithful, is that good things can be hard things and that God is faithful through them. So that brings us back to the main question here. And I know that that's a long segue, but I want us to really see, like, what does it look like to follow God when it's hard? That cultivating, that hardship of following God. So why do we do good things? We do good things because God's called us to do good things. Here's another quote from Tim Keller. It says, "In the short run, such a life of doing good things," is what he's referencing, "such a life demands a tremendous number of sacrifices. You bind your heart up emotionally to people who are unstable, so you experience great distress that you could have avoided. You cut yourself off from many options that you could have if you weren't in ministry relationships. You have less money since you are giving very generously to individuals and ministries and causes. The costs are many, but the reward," Paul hints, "are as much more of the costs are many, but the rewards," Paul hints, "are as much greater as the value of the harvest is greater than the cost of the seed." Let me say that again, that the rewards are as much greater as the value of the harvest that is greater than the seed. First, we often get direct and deep satisfaction of seeing changed lives. Second, we get the direct and deep satisfaction of seeing families and communities and even cities becoming good and happy places to live. Third, we may even see people whose burdens we've been bearing become burden bearers, change lives, which begin to change other lives. Because this is why we do good things. We do good things because God uses our faithfulness to change others. It is not an easy calling. It is not light. It is not, he specifically says, don't grow weary because it's going to be hard. In due season, we will reap if we do not give up. If we're a believer, we've been called to serve in the hard things that are good until God will continue to be faithful until we see the reaping. We see if we don't give up. Now, does that always mean that we see immediate changes? No. Some of the reaping that we will see will only be heavenly. That's why, like last week, as Pastor Derek was wrapping up the Acts series, he was talking about how Paul, even from jail, continued to be faithful in doing good. He wrote many of his letters from jail. As he was being persecuted, he was continuing to do the work of the gospel, right? That is a picture of doing good and not growing weary, that we're called to do as well. When we're called to follow Christ, we're called to pick up our cross and die. But we're promised that we will grow to be more like him, and that one day, even if we never see it this side, one day we'll be with him forever, and that we'll have all the sad things come untrue, right? That he will change everything forever. And that's our hope. That is why we do good things. So if you are a believer, God's called us to follow him and to do the good things, to continue to walk in the gospel and be made more like him. Maybe you're not a believer today. Today can be the first day that you believe alongside of us that Jesus is daily making us new and that he wants to make you new today. And you can start that process of following the good work of the Spirit through following Jesus. Wherever you're at today, we want to see lives change through the good work of the gospel. And we believe that God will, that he's faithful. He has and he'll continue to. Guys, planning a multi-ethnic church in a middle of a pandemic, like Pastor Erica said last week, I think, and I know has definitely said before, compared it to planting a tree in concrete. It's not easy. And we're at a point in the church, in our life of our church, where we can grow tired. But it's when we grow tired that we have to pick it up and say, let's go again. Let's go again. And that's where it says, first off, it talks about to the household of the faithful, let's bear one another's burdens. Walk through these things together. God has called us to hard things. He's called us to good things, but he's called us to do them together, and he's promised us that he'd be faithful. So in light of that, let's remember to just continue to live out the gospel where you're at, in the workplaces, your daily life, in each other's lives. And be faithful to where God's called you. Let's pray. God, thank you that you have saved us, that we have the good news of Jesus, that we don't have to try to earn it on our own, that we don't have to do good works for you to love us, God. I thank you that you do love us, and I pray that you would just help us to continue to follow you, God, that you would continue to create opportunities for us to do good in our lives, in our daily lives, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our classrooms, so that, God, we could see our lives changed and we could see the world changed. We love you and we know you that will continue to do these things because you've said they are true. They will be true. So Lord, help us to remain faithful. Help us through the Spirit to continue to do good work so that we'll see a harvest and so that we can be more and more like you. We love you, Jesus, and we pray these things in your precious name. Amen. As we do end, we do have our prayer team. We'll be down here. If there's something you're walking through that we can walk through with you, maybe you want to make a decision to follow Christ for the first time, wherever you're at, we'll be down here to talk or pray. But Proclamation family, let's go out and do good things even when they're hard. All right? Go and proclaim.